Excuse me, Chairman, before I ask the questions, can I just explain the reason for asking the full council is that I think it's important for members just to know that I have approached the council.
Mr. Brooks, if I may stop you, I'm terribly sorry. The script that you submitted with the questions are the questions that we must have answered this evening, and we're not able to take any comments on those
yes,
questions.
but I also have an issue with that, Chairman. I've submitted 5 questions to this council, and I was whittled down to 3, and told that if I didn't accept... Can I just finish this? I'm not going to go on long. I just need to get this point across.
Mr. Brooks,
we're
I
in a
must ask you to stop.
Society,
Mr. Brooks,
and I was told if I didn't accept...
I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, may I adjourn the meeting please for a moment? Thank you.
Unfortunately, I thought Rutland County Council was democratic.
Mr. Brooks, I am going to continue with the meeting, so I now will reopen the meeting. I must ask you to stick to the script, or I will be forced to ask you to leave the meeting. So if I could please ask you to ask your questions in the order that you've submitted them this evening. You do have the opportunity to ask a supplementary question once your initial question has been answered.
I will have one.
Okay, so if you'd like to ask question number 1, please.
Okay. As you said, from the script. Number 1. Does the council feel it is appropriate to ignore laws specific to the returning officer? For example, a returning officer must not be in dispute with any candidate. The returning officer is still in dispute with myself, and I understand also the second largest political group on this council. What is the council going to do to rectify this before the 2015 elections?
Thank you for your question. Mr. Bailey, I believe you're going to answer that this evening.
The council is well aware of the laws and rules governing the returning officer. The duties of the returning officer are separate from that person's duty as a local government officer. As returning officer, she is not responsible to the local authority, but is directly accountable to the courts as an independent statutory office holder. For this reason, the integrity of the returning officer's conduct of elections are strictly governed, regulated by the Electoral Commission, and a breach of the returning officer's duty without reasonable cause is in fact a criminal offence. You will be aware that the returning officer is not in dispute with you as a candidate in the forthcoming elections. In fact, as no notice of election has been posted, there are not as yet any candidates, so this question is in any case premature. But your question states that you consider yourself to be in dispute with the returning officer in her role as a returning officer, chief executive of this council, or any kind of personal level, is a matter entirely for you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Mr. Brooks, do you have a supplementary question?
Yes. So can the council please explain why Mr. Hind, the East Midlands returning officer, says that the responsibility for this complaint falls at this table?
Mr. Bailey.
I have taken legal advice on this, and my answer remains the same.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Brooks, would you like to ask your second question, please?
The returning officer over the years has been subjected to a number of complaints from various candidates. When I last stood for county, the returning officer was giving evidence in court against me in a case which I was found not guilty, and the evidence given was described by the district judge as mainly irrelevant. Can the council explain why they did not review the position of the returning officer at the time, and does the council not think it is time to review the position and perhaps swap with another authority such as Lincolnshire? That was just used as an example. It could be any authority.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey.
Mrs. Briggs gave evidence in a criminal court case at the request of the Crown Prosecution Service. It is not relevant to her role as returning officer. As I said, the duties of Mrs. Briggs as returning officer are separate from her duties as a local government officer and directly accountable to the courts as an independent statutory office holder. It is for this reason that the Electoral Commission exists as regulator and has set performance standards for returning officers and published their views accordingly. You will be well aware from your dealings with the Electoral Commission that they are entirely satisfied with the performance of the returning officer here and would actually be greatly perturbed were she to be replaced in the run-up to the general and local elections. Prior to the election you referred to, the view of the Electoral Commission was sought and they were unequivocal in their support for Mrs Briggs.
Mr Brooks, do you have a supplementary question?
Yes, it's based on the content of my question, and that was the evidence. I would basically like to know whether the council, who have been told that they cannot indemnify their officers, will be asking Mrs Briggs to reimburse the officers' time and the cost of producing the document which the judge described as 3 pages were only irrelevant. I can't remember offhand now how many pages there were, but I believe there was over 200 to 300 pages.
I will repeat my first sentence. Mrs Briggs gave evidence in a criminal court case at the request of the Crown Prosecution Service. It is not relevant to her role as returning officer.
It is when you pay for it.
Would you like to ask your third question?
Yes. During the trial at Leicester Magistrates Court, D.S. MacDonald referred to the returning officer's statement. He pointed out concerns about the Chief Executive's reputation and standing within the Conservative Party nationally. Does the Council find its returning officer's public allegiance to the Conservative Party acceptable and a good example of impartiality?
Mr Begley.
I'm not sure what D.S. MacDonald knew, said or knows about anyone's standing within the Conservative Party. As a member of that party and as leader of the Conservative group on this council, however, I can assure you that Mrs Briggs has both expressed and fully demonstrated her complete and utter political impartiality as an officer of this council.
Do you have a supplementary, Mr Brooks?
So can the Council explain why then it's on public record in a criminal statement that that is what she said?
Mr Begley.
My reply goes with the other 2 replies.
Mr Brooks, thank you for your questions. That is now the end of that particular item. So if I could ask you to consent to the public area. Thank you very much.
You haven't answered my questions.
Thank you very much. And we'll now move from the next agenda item, which is